We're talking about the brain development, and I am Dr. Sanal Rahman. In this section, we'll talk about the ventricular system. The ventricular system is present through the entirety of the brain. The various parts of ventricular system are formed by the various brain vesicles, the 5 secondary brain vesicles that we discussed in the previous section. Through this ventricular system, the cerebrospinal fluid flows and finally goes to the subarachnoid space, and it keeps on flowing through it, providing nutrition to the area, to the surrounding area. So we'll talk about the development of the ventricular system in this section, then we'll talk about the cerebrospinal fluid, and finally the clinical correlates. So referring to the figure, this is what the ventricular system of the brain looks like. We have two lateral ventricles. Here you can see these are the lateral ventricles. This is the anterior horn, this is the inferior horn, this is the posterior horn of the lateral ventricle. The lateral ventricle communicates with the third ventricle with the help of interventricular foramen. This interventricular foramen is also known as foramen of Monro. Here you can see this is the foramen of Monro. Now this third ventricle, it communicates with the fourth ventricle through the cerebral aqueduct. This cerebral aqueduct is also known as the cerebral aqueduct of Sylvius. Now finally, this is the fourth ventricle here, and there are apertures in the roof of the fourth ventricle from where these apertures are the foramina of Magendie and foramina of Luschka, through which the cerebrospinal fluid goes into the subarachnoid space. So the hindbrain cavity becomes the fourth ventricle. You can see from the position that it lies in the hindbrain, and the hindbrain cavity becomes the fourth ventricle. So now the cerebral aqueduct of Sylvius is formed by the narrowed mesencephalic cavity. So the mesencephalon, which was the primary midbrain vesicle, it narrows to form the cerebral aqueduct of Sylvius. Now we have this third ventricle. The third ventricle, it develops from the diencephalon cavity. So the diencephalon cavity, which was the secondary brain vesicle of the prosencephalon, it forms the third ventricle. Now the lateral ventricle, now the twin telencephalic cavities, the two lateralities that were developed from the prosencephalon, the telencephalon cavities, the two of them, they help in they form the lateral ventricles, and lateral ventricles are 2 in number. So this is about the anatomy of the ventricular system. Now let's see how the development proceeds. So the two lateral ventricles, they communicate with the with the third ventricle through interventricular foramina. So this interventricular foramen is known as foramen of Monro. Here you can see in the figure, and this is through which the lateral ventricle, here the anterior horn, the inferior horn, and the posterior horn, this entirety is the lateral ventricle. The lateral ventricle communicates with the third ventricle. Now the third ventricle, it communicates with the fourth ventricle through the cerebral aqueduct. Here you can see this is the third ventricle communicating with the fourth ventricle through the cerebral aqueduct. Now the fourth ventricle is continuous below with the central canal of the spinal cord. So this fourth ventricle below is continuous with the central canal of the spinal cord. Now it presents a small dilation at the inferior end, which is known as the terminal ventricle. So there's a small dilation at the inferior end, and this dilation is known as terminal ventricle. Now what flows in this ventricular system? This is the cerebrospinal fluid. So it is formed in the ventricle. This is the entirety of the ventricular system. This here you can see this is the lateral ventricle, then the third ventricle, this is the cerebral aqueduct of Sylvius, this is the fourth ventricle. Now, in the roof of the fourth ventricle, these are the openings towards the subarachnoid space. This is the subarachnoid space in dark blue. So, this cerebrospinal fluid is formed in the ventricles, and it mainly in the lateral ventricles by the choroid plexus. So here, in the lateral ventricles, this is the choroid plexus in dark blue. Here you can see this in dark blue is the choroid plexus. And this choroid plexus is responsible for the production of cerebrospinal fluid. So this leaves the ventricular system through apertures in the roof of the fourth ventricle. So the cerebrospinal fluid, it leaves the ventricular system through apertures in the roof of the fourth ventricle. It passes into the subarachnoid spaces around the brain and the spinal cord. So through this, it enters the subarachnoid space. Now, clinical correlates. These clinical correlates would be dealing with the development of the ventricular system and the flow of the cerebrospinal fluid. So we can have hydrocephalus. Hydro means water, cephalus means head. So the literal meaning of the term is water-filled head. Let's see how and what is happening. So there's dilation of ventricles due to excess accumulation of the cerebrospinal fluid. So we talked about it before. The cerebrospinal fluid is formed within the ventricles by the choroid plexus. Now, if for some reason there's either a lot of production, that is excessive production of cerebrospinal fluid, or there's obstruction to the flow of the cerebrospinal fluid, this CSF is being produced at a rate that it is supposed to be produced. However, there's obstruction or there's overproduction of this cerebrospinal fluid. This causes the fluid to accumulate within this within the ventricular system. Now, since it's a limited space, the fluid keeps on accumulating, and eventually there is a swelling of the area, and there's a lot of fluid in the head, giving rise to the clinical presentation of the hydrocephalus. The causes of hydrocephalus can be either due to overproduction or destruction of its or obstruction of its circulation. So there are two important causes: overproduction or obstruction of the flow. Then we have Dandy-Walker syndrome. So what happens in Dandy-Walker syndrome? There's atresia and blockage of apertures in the roof of the fourth ventricle. So in the roof of the fourth ventricle, here somewhere, there's blockage of apertures that cause the leakage of cerebrospinal fluid into the subarachnoid space. Now again, what would happen? If this cerebrospinal fluid does not go back into the subarachnoid space, there would be accumulation of this cerebrospinal fluid. The accumulation of this cerebrospinal fluid will cause symptoms of hydrocephalus. Now what happens is there's dilation of the fourth ventricle. Here you can see the dilated part. The agenesis of the cerebellar vermis, because this is the area that surrounds the area. Surrounds the fourth ventricle. There might be an occipital meningocele. Here you can see this is an occipital meningocele, and splenium of the corpus callosum may be visible. So these are the changes that occur in the Dandy-Walker syndrome. Again, why is that happening? There's obstruction of flow. There's obstruction to the flow of cerebrospinal fluid. Where does this obstruction lie? In the roof of the fourth ventricle. And from there, the CSF was supposed to go into the subarachnoid space. So this was all about this section. In this section, we talked about the ventricular system. So the ventricular system actually consists of two lateral ventricles. The two lateral ventricles, they converge and they drain into a third ventricle. The third ventricle now comes in contact with the fourth ventricle through the cerebral aqueduct of Sylvius. Now, through the fourth ventricle, through the foramina in its roof, this cerebrospinal fluid is released, or it's dumped into the subarachnoid space. Now, we also talked about the production of this cerebrospinal fluid. The cerebrospinal fluid is actually produced within the ventricular system, primarily in the lateral ventricles by the choroid plexus. From that, it flows through the lateral ventricles into the third ventricle, passing through the aqueduct of Sylvius, finally reaching the fourth ventricle and passing through the foramina in the roof of the fourth ventricle to enter the subarachnoid space. Now, if there is overproduction of this cerebrospinal fluid or obstruction to the flow of cerebrospinal fluid from this ventricular system into the subarachnoid space, we can either have hydrocephalus or we can have Dandy-Walker-White syndrome. So this was the importance of the ventricular system, the development of the ventricular system, and the clinical correlates. I hope you found them interesting and you understood them. For further sections, keep watching sqadia.com.